fire, fear, and the final journey of Elijah. Have you ever felt completely alone, even after a victory? Like you just did something incredible, but instead of joy, you feel empty inside. What if I told you that one of the greatest prophets in the Bible, the man who called fire from heaven, once ran for his life, begging God to let him die? Yes, this is not a story of just fire. It's a story of fear, of silence, of burnout, and of how God meets us. Not always in the fire, but in the whisper. This is the journey of Elijah, not the superhero we imagined, but the human soul we can all relate to. Because maybe you too have stood on your own Mount Carmel. You too have heard Jezebel's voice. You too have walked into the wilderness, wondering if you can keep going. So today, let's walk together, through fire, through fear, and toward the quiet place, where God still speaks. Let's begin. Have you ever been the only one in the room who believed something different? The only one who stood up when everyone else sat down? The only voice in a crowd that shouted the opposite? Imagine this. You're standing on top of a dry, sun-scorched mountain. The wind is hot, the sky is silent, and in front of you, 450 prophets of Baal, their eyes locked on you, their chants echo across the valley. You are alone. This was Elijah, one man, one prophet, one voice, standing against the tide. And he wasn't standing for popularity. He wasn't trying to win a debate. He was standing for truth, God's truth. Mount Carmel wasn't just a battlefield. It was a test of obedience, not numbers, not charisma, obedience. You see, Elijah didn't come here because he wanted the spotlight. He came because God told him to go. That's something we forget, don't we? In a world obsessed with crowds and followers, we often assume that the bigger group must be right. That if the numbers are against us, we should stay quiet, play it safe. But Elijah didn't play it safe. He stood up when no one else would. And the odds, completely insane, 450 to 1. Let that sink in for a moment. How many of us would dare speak up, not in a room, but in front of a nation? We talk about courage, but Elijah lived it. Not because he felt strong, but because he was convinced God was with him. This isn't just a Bible story, it's a mirror. Because here's the truth. You don't need a majority aim to be on the side of truth. Let me share something close to home. A few years ago, I knew a man, a government worker, who uncovered serious fraud in his department. When he tried to report it, his colleagues turned on him. They called him a traitor. They isolated him. Even his friends told him to let it go. But he didn't. Why? Because deep down, he knew what was right, and he had to speak. That man lost his job, but he kept his soul. Like Elijah, he stood alone, but not empty. There's a mistake we all make sometimes, thinking the crowd must be right. That truth is democratic, but truth is not a popularity contest. And here's the real tension of the story. God didn't send an army. He sent one man, because God doesn't count heads. He looks for hearts. He's not impressed by noise. He responds to obedience. And what happened next? Elijah stood up and prayed. Not a long, dramatic speech, not a chant, just a simple, honest prayer. Let it be known today that you are God. And then, fire fell from the sky. The altar exploded in flame. The stones shattered, the water evaporated, and the people fell to their knees. Because one man obeyed. You see, Elijah didn't bring the fire. He brought obedience, and God brought the fire. That's the secret. That's the lesson. We don't have to be spectacular. We just have to be faithful. You might not face 450 prophets, but maybe you're the only believer in your office. Maybe you're the only student in your class who stands for purity. Maybe you're the only parent in your family who still prays. If that's you, this story is yours. Because sometimes, the strongest faith is the faith that stands alone. But don't miss this. Elijah didn't win because he shouted louder. He won because he trusted deeper. And when we trust like that, heaven responds. So if today you feel outnumbered, if you feel like the only voice still speaking truth, remember Mount Carmel, remember Elijah, remember that God doesn't need a crowd to change a nation. All he needs is one heart that says, yes, are you willing? But hold on, The fire might have fallen, the crowd might have knelt, but Elijah's journey was far from over, because right after the fire came the fear. Let's keep walking. When God answers publicly. Have you ever seen something so real, so undeniable, that it changed everything? Not a dream, not a theory, but something visible, tangible, unforgettable. Now imagine this, an altar soaked with water, 12 jars of it, enough to make sure nothing would burn, at least not by human effort. 450 prophets watching, a king watching, a nation watching, and one man, Elijah, kneeling. He doesn't shout, he doesn't dance, he doesn't beg, he simply prays, "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel." And then it happened. Fire fell from heaven. Real fire, bright, violent, holy. It consumed the offering, the stones, the water, everything, gone. And suddenly, no one was asking if God was real anymore. This wasn't symbolism. It wasn't ritual. It was relationship. It was proof that God still speaks, that God still moves, that when we trust Him, He shows up, not quietly, but publicly. Let's stop here a second, because that's what we need to talk about. The difference between dead religion and living relationship. Religion knows how to build an altar. It knows the motions, the words, the customs. But it can't call down fire, because fire doesn't come from formula. It comes from faith. Too many of us settle for a version of faith that looks good on the outside, but has no power on the inside. We go to church. We say the right words. We check the spiritual boxes, but we don't expect God to actually do anything. We sing, but we don't listen. We pray, but we don't wait. We believe, but we don't expect. It's like we believe in a museum version of God, historical, interesting, but no longer active. But Elijah believed in a God who answers. And when he prayed, God didn't whisper, He roared. Let me tell you a story. A friend of mine, let's call him David, grew up in church. He knew the songs. He led small groups. He even preached once or twice. But when his marriage collapsed, when his wife walked away, his faith collapsed too. He told me, "I realized I'd never actually expected God to move in my life. I knew about Him, but I didn't really know Him." Then one night, alone in his apartment, David did what Elijah did. He stopped performing. He stopped pretending. He just prayed, simple, raw, real. And God didn't send literal fire, but He sent clarity, peace, and a healing that began that very night. That's not religion, that's relationship. Here's the danger. If you only ever interact with God through ritual, you'll miss Him when He shows up in power. You'll write it off. You'll explain it away. You'll miss the fire because you weren't expecting it. Friend, God still answers. He still acts. He still burns through doubt and darkness with undeniable glory. But we have to be like Elijah. We have to stop trying to manipulate outcomes. Stop trying to impress people. Stop thinking we need to be loud, to be heard. Instead, we pray. We surrender. We trust. Elijah didn't bring the fire. God did. Elijah just built the altar and believed. So what about you? Have you been chasing rituals instead of relationship? Have you been performing instead of praying? Have you settled for symbols? When God wants to show you substance, don't settle. God's not looking for perfect people. He's looking for available ones. Ones who will kneel at a water-soaked altar, believing that even now, fire can fall. Because it can. And when it does, no one can deny it. Not your critics. Not your doubts. Not even you. That's what real faith looks like. It doesn't just know the story, it expects to live it. But just when the fire came down, so did the pressure, because the next voice Elijah heard was not God's. It was Jezebel's. And her voice would send the prophet running. Have you ever prayed and heard nothing back? Have you ever done everything right and still saw no results? What do you do when heaven goes quiet? After the fire fell on Mount Carmel, Elijah could have walked away. He could have said, "That's enough. God showed up. My job is done." But he didn't. Instead, he climbed higher, up the mountain again, this time not to face the prophets, but to wait on God, because there was still something missing, the rain. And so Elijah knelt, head between his knees, alone, quiet, waiting. He prayed, and then he said to his servant, Go look toward the sea." The servant went, came back. Nothing. Elijah didn't flinch. He prayed again, and again, and again. 7 times. 7 times before anything changed. Let that sink in. Elijah, the man who just called fire from heaven, had to pray 7 times before a cloud appeared. What does that tell us? That even the most powerful people of faith sometimes have to wait, because not every miracle is immediate. Some are gradual, some require patience, and some are tests of obedience more than tests of ability. We love fire from heaven moments, but do we have the faith for rain after silence moments? Let me share a story. There's a woman named Linda. Her son got addicted to painkillers in high school. For 10 years, she prayed every day, every night, every tear. Nothing changed. He got worse. He disappeared for weeks, came back angry, hopeless. But Linda kept praying, even when it hurt, even when it looked pointless, even when her own family told her to give up. And then, one day, he called. "I'm done," he said. "I want help." Today, he's clean, married, and leading a recovery group. But that miracle didn't happen in a moment. It came after 10 years of obedience. You see, sometimes faith is not about power. It's about persistence. It's not about dramatic moments. It's about consistent trust. Elijah kept praying when nothing changed. That's what faith looks like. The mistake we make? We quit too soon. We think if God doesn't answer quickly, He's not listening. Or worse, He's not there. But silence doesn't mean absence, and delay doesn't mean denial. Sometimes God is working before we ever see the sign. Elijah didn't wait for thunder. He believed at the first sign of a cloud, and it wasn't a big one. It was the size of a man's hand, tiny, insignificant, easy to miss. But to Elijah, it was enough, because real faith doesn't need the storm to start praising. It just needs the cloud. What about you? Have you given up too soon? Have you stopped praying because nothing changed? Maybe your breakthrough is waiting on your obedience. Maybe it's prayer number 7. Or maybe it's just showing up again tomorrow. Faith isn't always loud. It's often quiet, steady, daily. The kind of faith that keeps building altars even when the sky is clear. So here's the question. Can you keep praying when the answer hasn't come? Can you keep trusting even when the drought continues? Because the God who sends fire is also the God who sends rain. But sometimes the rain comes after the 7th prayer. And just when Elijah saw that cloud, just when the storm began to rise, another storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in the palace. A woman named Jezebel had heard what happened, and now her voice would shake the prophet to his core. The power of one voice. Have you ever heard just one voice? And it changed everything? Not the voice of God, not a crowd, just one voice, one message, one sentence, one threat. And suddenly, your confidence cracks, your strength fades, your faith shakes. That's what happened to Elijah. Right after the fire, right after the victory, right after he stood before a nation and saw God move, came a voice. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't an army, it was a woman named Jezebel. And she didn't shout, she didn't plead, she sent a message. By this time tomorrow, you'll be dead. That's it. One sentence, one threat. And the prophet, the man who faced 450 prophets without flinching, ran for his life. He didn't fight, he didn't pray, he fled. Now let that settle in. Because what this tells us is something we don't like to admit. Even spiritual giants can be undone by a whisper of fear. Here's the question. How can someone so bold fall so fast? How does the man who called down fire from heaven end up hiding in the wilderness, begging to die? The answer is simple. He was tired. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. He had just climbed the mountain of faith and forgot to rest at the top. And that's where many of us fall. Not in the valley, but on the mountaintop. After the conference, after the breakthrough, after the answer to prayer, because we think victory means we're invincible. But the truth, victory makes us vulnerable if we don't pause to be filled again. Elijah didn't lose to Jezebel's army. He lost to her words. And words have power. Today, it's not Jezebel threatening you, but maybe it's that one comment on social media, that one email, that one person who said, "You're not enough, you're crazy." you'll fail. And suddenly, everything God just did in your life starts to feel distant, unreal, unstable. This happens more often than we think. A CEO crushes a company presentation, but one critic calls it amateur, and they spiral into anxiety. A young woman shares her testimony online, but one troll calls her fake, and she takes it all down. A pastor preaches the sermon of his life, but one family leaves the church, and he questions his calling. Friend, one voice can destroy us if we're not anchored in the right voice. And that's the tragedy. Elijah listened to Jezebel, but he forgot to listen to God. And that's the turning point in this story. Because here's the deeper lesson. Spiritual strength isn't just about standing tall in public. It's about staying filled in private. You can't pour out what you haven't been refilled with. And Elijah had been pouring and never stopped to be poured into. So when Jezebel spoke, he had no reserves left. That's the danger of running on empty. It's not just burnout, it's breakdown. And it doesn't look like weakness at first. It looks like isolation, irritability, spiritual numbness, avoidance, until you're alone in the desert saying, God, just let me die. That's where Elijah was. Not because God failed, but because Elijah never stopped to recover. And neither do we. We keep going. One more task, one more message, one more prayer for someone else. But inside, we're dry, exhausted, unprotected. We've left no room for stillness, no margin for rest, no space to hear the right voice. So what do we learn? When you reach a high, build in a holy pause. Rest, retreat, recharge, because the same mountain where God sends fire can also be the place where fear finds you. And if you don't guard your spirit, if you don't nourish your soul, you'll be vulnerable to voices that should have never shaken you. But don't worry, this isn't where Elijah's story ends, because even in the wilderness, even in the moment of despair, God was not done, not even close. And what God does next is not what you'd expect. He doesn't rebuke, he doesn't scold, he whispers. Running empty when strength fades. Have you ever been so exhausted you didn't even want to wake up? So tired. You weren't just physically drained, you were spiritually done. Elijah knows exactly how that feels. This is the same man who called fire from heaven, who watched rain return after years of drought, who stood up to kings and faced down false prophets. But now, he's lying under a tree, alone, in the desert, saying, Lord, I've had enough. Take my life. It's one of the most raw human moments in all of Scripture, because sometimes the strongest faith warrior hits rock bottom, and Elijah hit it hard. Here's what we often miss. This didn't happen in a moment of failure. It happened after a string of victories, which tells us something powerful. You don't burn out because you're weak. You burn out because you've been strong for too long. Let me say that again. You don't crash because you failed. You crash because you've been carrying too much for too long without rest. Elijah had just poured out everything, his passion, his strength, his words, his heart, but he never paused to be filled back up. And now, he's empty, completely. That's what burnout looks like. Not just tired, but numb, disconnected, done. You stop dreaming. You stop feeling. You stop hoping. You just want it to be over. Sound familiar? Because it should. It's the silent epidemic no one preaches about enough. Spiritual leaders, pastors, CEOs parents, volunteers, they keep going, keep performing, keep saying yes, until one day they can't, because their soul has been running on fumes. Let me tell you a story. There's a man named Greg. He's a church planter in Texas, bold, passionate, gifted. For 5 years, he gave everything to his new church. He never took a vacation, never missed a Sunday, always on, always giving. Then one day, he couldn't get out of bed. He wasn't sick. He wasn't lazy. He was empty. He told me later, I thought burnout was for people who didn't pray enough. Turns out, I was the one who stopped listening. Greg didn't need another sermon. He needed rest, silence, healing. So did Elijah. And look what happens next. God doesn't rebuke him. God doesn't say, get up, man of God. Instead, God sends an angel to touch him, to feed him, to let him sleep twice. Because when you're empty, God doesn't give you a lecture. He gives you mercy. You see, Elijah didn't need a pep talk. He needed nourishment. And maybe today, so do you. Maybe you're not weak. You're just tired. Maybe you don't need more discipline. You need more grace. Maybe what your soul needs most isn't another assignment, but a sacred pause. Here's the dangerous lie: that we always have to be strong, that we always have to show up, that rest is weakness, that collapse is failure. But Scripture says something different. Even Jesus withdrew. Even he rested. Even he said no sometimes. So why do we believe we're supposed to keep going without stopping? The truth, rest isn't rebellion, it's obedience. And exhaustion, it's not failure, it's a signal. It's your soul's way of saying, come back to the source. So here's the question: when was the last time you let God refill you? Not just with a verse, not just with a worship song, but with quiet, stillness, presence. Elijah ran into the wilderness thinking he was done, but what he found there was that God wasn't done with him yet. Not even close, because just ahead, beyond the fatigue, was a moment that would change everything. Not a fire, not a storm, but a whisper. Not in the fire. What if God wasn't in the fire? What if he wasn't in the noise, the spectacle, the thing everyone expected? What if the answer you're waiting for, the voice you're longing to hear, isn't loud, but quiet? That's what Elijah found. After all the fire, after all the fear, after running empty into the wilderness, he found himself in a cave, alone, afraid, asking questions. God, where are you? And God said, come out, stand before me. And then, the unexpected happened. A mighty wind tore through the mountains, so strong it shattered rocks. But God wasn't in the wind. Then came an earthquake. The ground shook. The cave trembled. But God wasn't in the earthquake. Then came fire, bright, violent, but God wasn't in the fire. And finally, a whisper, a gentle, still, small voice, and Elijah covered his face, because that's where God was. Not in the power, not in the drama, not in the performance, in the whisper. Let's talk about this, because we live in a world of volume. Everything is loud. Ads scream at us. News alerts buzz every minute. Social media never sleeps. Opinions fly. Crowds cheer. Critics shout. We are drowning in sound. And in that noise, we start to believe that God must compete with it. We expect him to show up in fireworks, in booming moments, in platform-level power. But more often than not, God still comes in a whisper, not because he's small, but because he's close. Whispers don't travel far. You can only hear them when you're near. And that's the point. God doesn't shout to get your attention. He draws you close so he can speak gently. Let me tell you a story. There's a man named Chris. He'd been going through a rough season. Work stress, family tension, silent prayers. He'd been going to church, serving, singing, doing all the right things. But he felt nothing. One night, driving alone down a Texas highway, the radio off, his mind racing, he just said, God, I can't do this anymore. And in that moment, he felt something. Not a miracle, not a voice from heaven, just peace. A stillness he hadn't felt in years. Later, he told me, I didn't need God to fix everything. I just needed to know he was still with me. That's the whisper. Not always a word, but a presence. Not a solution, but a shift. You see, sometimes God doesn't change your situation. He changes you. In the quiet, in the cave, after the fire. And here's the danger. We often miss him because we're only looking for him in the dramatic. We think if the music isn't loud, the spirit isn't there, if the crowd isn't big, God must not be moving. If the stage isn't shaking, then maybe we've been forgotten. But Elijah reminds us, God doesn't always move how we expect. He moves how we need. And sometimes what we need most is not noise, but nearness. Maybe that's why God waited. Maybe that's why he let Elijah burn out, so he could teach him to listen again. Because when life is loud, it's easy to confuse performance with presence. But when it's quiet, when all that's left is your breath and his, that's where intimacy is born. So here's the question. Are you listening for the whisper? Or are you too distracted by the wind, the earthquake, the fire? Are you willing to sit in the silence long enough to let God speak? It's not always comfortable. Stillness can feel empty. Quiet can feel like nothing. But it's not nothing. It's where God does his deepest work. And the truth, sometimes God doesn't change your surroundings because he's trying to change your soul. Not with force, not with pressure, but with presence. And that presence is more than enough. But this moment in the cave, it's not the end. Because after the whisper, God gives Elijah something new. A name, a mission, a mantle to pass on. And what comes next is about legacy. You're not alone. Have you ever felt like the last one left? The last one who still believes? The last one who still prays? The last one holding on to what's right in a world that seems to have let go? Elijah did. After the fire fell, after the rain returned, after the whisper in the cave, Elijah looked up and said something many of us have whispered in our hearts. Lord, I am the only one left. Not, I'm one of a few. Not, we're getting smaller. He said, I am the only one. It wasn't true, but it felt true. And that's what makes this moment powerful, because Elijah didn't say this in rebellion. He said it in exhaustion. His heart was tired. His soul was isolated. He had stood alone for so long, he forgot he wasn't actually alone. And God responded, not with correction, but with revelation. Elijah, he said, I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal. 7,000. While Elijah thought he was the last candle burning, God had already lit 7,000 more. Let's pause here, because feeling alone is one of the most dangerous lies in the walk of faith. It makes you retreat. It makes you question. It makes you believe that you're fighting a battle already lost. And today, more than ever, many believers feel exactly like Elijah. Especially in the Western world, you speak up about your faith in your workplace and get labeled intolerant. You try to raise your kids to know God, and people call you outdated. You pray for your family, and they laugh behind your back. And slowly, you start to wonder, is it just me now? Let me tell you a story. A man named James works at a major tech company. Brilliant guy, high-level manager. He's also a devoted believer, reads his Bible every day on the train, prays over his team silently before meetings, tries to live with quiet integrity. But he told me once, I feel invisible. No one here cares. Sometimes I think I'm the last Christian in Silicon Valley. But then he met a janitor in the same building who told him, I've been praying for the executives in this place for years. Suddenly James realized he wasn't alone. He just hadn't seen the others. That's the beauty of Elijah's moment. God didn't bring all 7,000 to line up in front of him. He just let Elijah know they existed, because sometimes you don't need to see the crowd. You just need to know the crowd is there. And maybe today, you need to know that too. You are not the last one. You are not holding up the kingdom alone. You're part of something bigger. There are mothers praying in their kitchens, retired men interceding in quiet rooms, teenagers worshiping in secret, small groups gathering with no spotlight, no stage, no Instagram, but God sees them, and He's using them. You might feel alone, but you're surrounded by the faithful unseen. Here's the mistake we often make. We measure our faith by how visible it is to others. If no one's liking, sharing, responding, we think it must not matter. But Elijah reminds us, faithfulness is not always loud. Sometimes it's silent and strong, and God sees it all. So what's the lesson here? Don't let your feelings define your faith. Don't let isolation turn into imagination. And don't ever believe the lie that God has forgotten His people, because He hasn't. And He never will. God always keeps a remnant. He always has a people. He always has a plan, even when you can't see it, even when you feel like the last one. You are not alone. But there's one more thing Elijah had to do. He had seen the fire. He had heard the whisper. He had found out he wasn't alone. Now, he had to pass on what he carried to prepare the next generation, because faith is not just something we keep. It's something we pass. Passing the mantle, preparing the next generation. Have you ever wondered, what will happen after you're gone? Who will carry what you've carried? Who will pray the way you prayed? Who will stand when you're no longer standing? That's the question Elijah had to face. He wasn't dying yet, but he was coming to the end of his mission. And he knew something had to continue, because fire may fall, rain may return, caves may whisper. But if the next generation isn't ready, the mission stops. And Elijah understood that. So God led him to a young man in a field, Elisha, plowing, working, not preaching, not leading, just faithful in the ordinary. And Elijah did something powerful. He didn't give a sermon, he didn't host a conference. He simply walked up and placed his mantle on Elisha's shoulders. That moment changed everything, because mantles aren't just about authority, they're about trust. They say, "What God gave me, I now give to you." Let's pause here, because in our world, we don't think about legacy enough. We chase success. We build platforms. We want to finish strong. But if we don't pass on what God has given us, it ends with us. That's the mistake many leaders make. They hold on tight. They protect what's theirs. They think, no one can do it like I can. And maybe they're right. But that doesn't matter. Because the goal of your calling is not to be the best, but to make sure it doesn't die with you. Let me tell you a story. There's a pastor in South Carolina. He led his church for over 40 years. Powerful preacher, respected man, faithful husband and father. But what made him truly great wasn't his sermons. It was that in his final 5 years, he started mentoring 3 young pastors. Every Tuesday, same booth at a local diner, Bible open, heart open. He told them not just what to preach, but how to listen. Not just how to lead, but how to love. When he passed away, those 3 men planted 3 more churches, and the movement kept moving. That's legacy, not applause, but multiplication. And that's what Elijah did. He gave Elisha the mantle, not just as a symbol, but as a mission. And Elisha followed. He burned his plow, left his old life, and walked in the path Elijah had cleared. That's how the kingdom advances. One generation making room for the next. Now here's the hard truth. If you don't prepare your Elisha, your calling dies with you. But if you pour into them, your calling lives on long after you're gone. And that doesn't just apply to preachers. It applies to parents, mentors, teachers, bosses, friends. Every one of us has something we've learned, fought for, prayed through that someone younger desperately needs. The question is, are we passing it on, or are we holding it too tightly? Here's the trap. We think we're being faithful by finishing strong, but faithfulness is not just about how you finish. It's about what you leave behind. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is not to lead louder, but to kneel lower and place the mantle on someone else's shoulders. Even Jesus did this. Before the cross, he didn't write a book. He washed feet. He trained 12. He passed the mission. And now, here we are, still walking in that legacy. So what about you? Who's your Elisha? Who are you mentoring, teaching, encouraging? Maybe it's your son, your daughter, a student, a young believer at church. Don't underestimate the power of your voice, your time, your prayers. They may be the mantle someone else is waiting for. And when Elijah finally left this world, he didn't die. He was taken, carried to heaven in a whirlwind. But his story continued, because the fire didn't stop with him. It passed on, and so can yours. Now the question is, will you pass the mantle? Fan Chin, payoff, the journey of Elijah. So what do we learn from Elijah? That even the strongest can grow tired. That fire may fall, but fear can follow. That faith is not just loud on the mountain, but quiet in the cave. That rain sometimes comes only after 7 prayers. And yes, that you are never truly alone, even when it feels like it, because God always has a remnant. He always has a whisper. He always has a next step. Elijah's journey wasn't perfect, but it was real, human, holy, and that's why it speaks to us. You may not be facing 450 prophets. You may not be hiding in a cave, but maybe you're tired, you're questioning, you're waiting for the next cloud, or maybe you're holding the mantle and wondering who to pass it to. Wherever you are in that journey, know this: God still speaks, God still moves, and God still uses people just like Elijah, people just like you. So let this story remind you, you don't need to be perfect, you don't need to be popular, you just need to be present and obedient. The rest, that's God's job. If this video spoke to you, if Elijah's story touched something deep in your heart, would you share it with someone who needs it too? Leave a comment. Let us know where you are in your journey. What part of Elijah's story felt like your story? And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. because the journey of faith isn't meant to be walked alone. We're walking it together. See you in the next one.